Can you hear me now? Wonderful. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me, and thanks Gabrielle and Nadia and Don for setting up this CTG seminar series. Yeah, like Gabrielle mentioned, today's talk is going to cover, it's mostly an offshoot actually of some of my PhD work in one of the lesser known regions of the Canadian Shield, and that's in the Ray Craton in particular. But first, I just wanted to quickly give a quick mention or shout out to my supervisor, Dan Gibson, as well as co-supervisors Sally Pearson and Daniele Regis at the GSC, as well as Edith Martel at the Northwest Territories Survey, who are all instrumental in being a part of this work here. Great. There we go. Okay, so before getting you up to speed on a research question or what this talk's really going to be about, I just wanted to introduce the general region so you have an idea of where and when we are. So this is a cartoon Cambrian basement map of North America. And in particular, it highlights cratons and origins that were involved in the amalgamation of Nuna, which is a supercontinent that formed about 1.8 billion years ago. Now I've highlighted the Archaean Cratons. You can see the Slave, the Ray, Superior. These Cratons have dominantly an Archaean history, that is Meso to Neo-Archean crust formation, tectonic history. But since then, they largely started to cool, become stiff, rigid bodies, and don't have really significant histories after that, except perhaps orogenic events on their margins. The southern part of the Ray Craton, however, has quite a different history, and part of this reason is because it's a little bit smaller and it had successive Paleoproterozoic overprinting origins that affected it. So it kept the lithosphere fairly hot and mobile, as well as the lower and middle crust were overprinted by numerous tectonic events. This makes the Southern Ray both quite complex and also fairly interesting, and worthwhile to study various geological processes there. To zoom into this region, this is a magnetic map of broadly the South Ray and its surrounding features. On the southeast, you can see the Hearn Craton. In the northwest is the Slave, and I've also outlined the Tolston and Thiessen origins on the west. Within the South Ray, you can see a variety of different magnetic patterns and signatures. And broadly speaking, the South Ray has been demarked by a number of crustal domains that have roughly unique geologic histories, and they're all bounded by large-scale shear zones. Those are the shear zones are in black there. And in today's talk, I'm going to talk about mostly data that falls along this yellow dotted line transect from the northwest to the southeast. I will also incorporate data and discussions from regions along strike as well. But just for the purpose of simplicity, especially for those that don't know the region, I want to think about the data that I'm going to talk about today as a transect from west to east. And so along this yellow dashed line, I made a cartoon lithosphere figure here that delineates the various domains we have in the South Ray's Northwest Territories. On the far west, we have the Tolston Origin and Buffalo Head terrain, and on the far east, we transitioned into the Hearn Craton. Now, what I wanted to show you with this figure is just a very simple schematic illustration of the distribution of high-grade tectonothermal events that have affected the crust there. The first being, I'm going to call it Mccoidorogenesis, that roughly, this is the Neo-Archean or Archean event, roughly falls between the time frame of 2.6 to 2.5 billion years old. This is represented by gray circles, and you can see it's represented in basically all the domains in the Southern Ray. It's a very widespread event. This is roughly the same type of event that you'd see in most Archaean Cratons, a lot of Archaean crust formation and tectonism. The second orogenic event I want to talk about is the Aerosmith Origin. That's the yellow circle. This is the earliest Paleoproterozoic origin. It's broadly between 2.5 and 2.3 GA. And in the southern ray, we only really see strong evidence of this origin in a single shear bounded domain, which is the McCann domain there in the center of the Craton. The third orogenic system I want to talk about is, I've lumped two into one. It's the Tolston and Snowbird. These occur on the west and east margins of the ray, respectively. These are broadly occurred between about 2 and 1.9 billion years ago. And as you can see from the diagram, the white circles are really isolated on the margins of the Craton. We don't see much evidence for this event towards the center. And finally, as the title of the talk alluded to a bit, I want to get to this final phase, which I'm calling the Trans-Hudson Phase. And when I say Trans-Hudson, what I'm referring to is the later phases of the Trans-Hudson, when we're starting to get terminal collision of both the Sask and superior Cratons into the Western Churchill province. And that's roughly bracketed between 187 and 1.8 billion years ago. And you can see the black circles there. There's of course overprinting in the Hearn Craton on the east, which is the closest Craton to these indenters, even farther east. But within the South Ray, we seem to have high-grade Trans-Hudson events in a few centrally located domains. And so broadly speaking, my thesis work really focused on the eastern part of this Craton, some domains and shear zones in their structural and metamorphic histories. But today's talk, even though I'll incorporate some of my thesis work, it also, today's talk will focus more on some new data collected from the Western Ray margin. And really the goal of today's talk is to walk through each of these major orogenic phases, understand how these orogenic phases have affected the entirety of the Southern Ray Craton, and through looking at where their high grade or high pressure overprints are, as well as phases of the origin that exhumed early versus late, or early structures that developed that were then reactivated. Through a careful analysis of all of these phases, we can really understand why we have a seemingly complex crustal architecture that's preserved today. So I'd like to start with the oldest one and go through chronologically. I should also mention that I'm presenting new data that will either help fill gaps for each of these phases, or I'll just be able to tie in the data to pre-existing models for some of these orogenic phases. Starting with the Mccoid though, this is the Neo-Archean orogenic phase, broadly 2.6 to 2.5 GA. I'll also introduce this new slide, which I'll show a few times. This is a fairly detailed Geocron chronological summary of data from the South Ray. The west is on the left, the east is on the right. Time axis is the y-axis, and all the domains are listed on the top. You shouldn't have to remember all of them though. The black diapir symbols refer to magmatic crystallization ages, whereas the black little bars refer to dike crystallization. The white circles are metamorphic ages, and the orange boxes are depositional ages for different sedimentary systems. And the blue circles are cooling ages, argon-argon data from biotite and hornblende. And so the red box I've highlighted here overlaps broadly in time the Mccoid orogenic system, and you can see that there's abundant Plutonism and metamorphism more or less recorded across the entire region at this time. This, of course, was a major crust formation age in the Ray. More regionally, pull in some data from the north here as well. You can see this is another simplified cartoon geological map of the Canadian Shield. You can see I placed a number of yellow circles throughout the Ray Craton. That refers to magmatism. That's broadly Mccoid age, so between 2.7. It goes as far back as 2.7 and as young as 2.5 in places. And this magmatism is a little bit older than the high pressure metamorphism we see around 2.55 along the eastern ray margin. And that's delineated by these yellow triangles, along with broadly parallel to what we now call the Snowbird tectonic zone, which now separates the ray and the Hearn Cratons. And so one could think of this broad regional system somewhat analogous to a modern collisional system where we have early convergence, abundant magmatism, and then sort of finalized by a collisional phase in high pressure metamorphism and exhumation at closer to the trench. Broadly speaking, this model seems to work, although there's been very little work in the South Ray to talk about, especially the western part of the South Ray, to quantify the metamorphism and related events at this time. And I'm just going to go through 4 new samples that I've collected in the blue circles there and show you how they fit into this Mccoid-Orogenic model. So first, we have a new crystallization age for a meta-andesite. It's about 2.6 GA. It's not terribly interesting on the face of it, but the interesting part is that in the South Ray, until recently, we haven't really discovered any Archaean metavolcanics or greenstone belts the way that the central and northern ray seems to preserve those things. And so our analysis in the western part of the South Ray did turn up abundant meta-andesites, as well as you can see a picture on the bottom left there. It's a variolithic basalt and other mafic and volcanic supercrustals. So this just confirms the continuity between different parts of the ray, even though it hadn't been seen yet in the southern part. As for metamorphic ages and quantification of that, this is a new sample. This is a garnetiferous leucosome or patch diatexite, basically a melt of a sedimentary rock. Monazite within this leucosome was dated and gave a fairly good age of 2575. An additional sample, this is a semi-politic raft in a leucosome. The samples like this were analyzed both for PT constraints and for zircon and monazite ages. This particular sample returned a peak metamorphic age of about 2.6. This is both recorded in zircon and monazite. But interestingly, the monazite also have a slight isotopic resetting signature that goes towards about 2.3 GA. And I'll get back to that a little later. As for PT constraints for this distant west portion of the ray here within this semi-politic raft, we have an interesting metamorphic assemblage that contains staurolite and spinel, as well as limonite, biotite, plagioclase, and ilmenite. And on the right image is PT constraints using tweak conventional thermal barometry that also agrees with other independent work of max pressure conditions of about 4 kilobars and max temperature conditions of about 600 degrees Celsius. And this broadly agrees with that Mccoid model I showed you earlier of magmatism and not really significant burial in the distant hinterland away from the trench. This was also a new sample analyzed where we were able to obtain a max depositional age of about 2.56. This is a rarely observed Archaean sediment. It does not have the Mccoid high pressure or high temperature overprint in it. It seems to have been deposited on top of basement that records the high metamorphic grades. And so putting these little bits of data together and coming back to this model, I'd say it broadly does fit into this model of early accretion along the east margin, widespread magmatism, and been able to finally quantify the PT constraints and confirm some metamorphic ages in the western part of the South Ray to young Mccoid 2.6, 2.57 metamorphism, low pressure, high temperature regime, immediately prior to high pressure metamorphism along the trench. And then interestingly, this metasediment that I analyzed in and of itself is not not too much information is gleaned, but I know there's a few other examples of these sediments throughout the South Ray, and there's been a little bit more study of some of these sediments up in the Boothia Peninsula, up in the northern part of the Ray, or I probably shouldn't call it Ray, up here. And I think Mary Sanborn-Berry and her team have been working on these, and if they correspond with our sediments, what we're likely seeing is this quite large Craton scale extensional event where these sediments are related to some extension and possibly even rifting that's occurring late in the Mccoidorogenic phase. So we're starting to see a lot of details of this Mccoid origin throughout the entire Ray now, which is nice. A simplified cartoon model might look something like this. Again, where we have convergence, widespread magmatism throughout the Ray. We're developing a suture. This could be the initial development of what's now called the Snowbird tectonic zone. I've also called it the Mccoid suture on the east Ray margin there. And there's also sedimentation, which here I've listed as drawn as coming from the orogenic high, but it also may be a later orogenic phase during denudation. And so this Mccoid suture or Snowbird tectonic zone is an important feature that we'll see becomes reactivated numerous times. Next, we'll move on to the Aerosmith orogenic phase. This is the time frame 2.5 to 2.3 GA. This is actually a picture of the sediment, the metasediment I was just talking about, the Archaean metasediment. However, the abundant leucosome development in it is Aerosmith aged. So again, going back to this detailed geochron diagram, we can see that the majority of the South Ray has very little or no Aerosmith time events. There seems to be a dominant mode in the McCann domain where we have abundant high temperature metamorphism and plutonism. And we also see plutonism farther west, not necessarily part of the Ray basement, we're not sure, within the Tolston basement of the Tolston origin. But overall, we see very little Aerosmith overprint in the South Ray. Now, looking back at those samples I just showed you that have an Archaean affinity, and plotting them up here, you can see that the sedimentary rock that was in the McCann domain, the yellow triangle, is the one that preserves very high grade Aerosmith aged metamorphism. So that's at least 800 degrees Celsius and probably at least 8 kilobars at about 2.36 GA. As we move west into Boomerang domain, this was another Archaean migmatite. This one is the one that preserves no real metamorphic resetting of its mineral assemblage, but a little bit of isotopic resetting of the monazite population at around 2.3. And then we jump left again to another sample, or west again. That's the blue circle. This is another sample that showed Archaean aged migmatite development. This sample actually doesn't have any Aerosmith aged overprint, and in fact, it preserves Aerosmith aged cooling recorded by both biotite and hornblende argon-argon thermochronology. So more regionally speaking, Aerosmith events in the Ray as a whole is mostly seen on the far west margin of the Ray. Although once we get into the southern Ray, we see that it's really isolated into the central portion. Now I should mention that even though we have Aerosmith aged cooling immediately west of our study area, there's an ongoing mapping project under in the vicinity of the Nanacho Basin, just west of this study area. And they may reveal that Aerosmith metamorphism continues out there. We'll await their results. But again, trying to put this into a context for a simplified cartoon, it looks something like this. And I'll first draw your attention to the east part of the diagram, the right side, where we have this pale peachy pink color, and that refers to the crust that was deeply buried and underwent high-grade metamorphism in the Archaean, and now it's showing its possible crustal position at Aerosmith time. So the idea is that it was probably exhumed and is now sitting in a more upper crustal position adjacent to the Snowbird tectonic zone. as for those 3 Aerosmith age samples I just mentioned, we seem to have a stepwise progression from the east to the west, from the hottest and most deeply buried to a sample that wasn't affected at all and probably stayed high in the crust. And so I've drawn up this simplified diagram to show that these 3 samples may be situated in a retroarc setting, where the deepest burial and exhumation occurred in the east, and we seem to be riding high right in the center, and possibly even preserving a little chunk of an orogenic lid that never completely eroded away. And I'll get back to that, that idea a little bit later. And again, we're developing a suture zone here. I've labeled it Aerosmith suture, and this is again an area that will get reactivated in subsequent events. This next phase I want to talk about, I actually didn't mention in the introduction. This is what I'm calling an extensional phase, even though there's probably a lot more complexity to this time frame. But it's a broad time frame, about 300 million years, where very little is happening and very little is known to happen in the ray as a whole. This picture is of a gabbroic anorthosite complex that formed at about 2.04 GA. And I'll show some data corresponding to this complex coming up. But first, to get into, sort of lead us into this, this extensional phase, I want to show you some new data from a sedimentary sample that was caught up in the Howard Lake shear zone. This is the brown circle in the middle of that black box. Again, this is another magnetic aeromagnetic diagram of this western South Ray region. There's 2 sediments actually that have very similar characteristics. I'm going to mostly show you data from this one, but the other one's also being worked on by Ben Neal, who's now at the University of Alberta. So this new sedimentary unit, you can see it's caught up in this left diagram. It's caught up in what's called the Howard Lake shear zone. It's this thin attenuated lens of rusty brown schist, mostly composed of muscovite, plage, and biotite. Interestingly, the detrital spectra from this sample was mostly Archaean, although there's one small population right around 2 billion years ago. And if you look on the right part of this diagram, this is a more detailed view of a single grain that had 3 spots on it, laser spots around 2 GA. And then that single grain was broken into 3 fragments and analyzed by CA TIMS. And the upper intercept of a regression through those analysis gives an age of 2041 or 2.04 GA. And so I'm taking that to be the max depositional age of this sediment. If that's not incredibly convincing, I can get into more detail later, but the second sample that Ben is working on has a much more convincing population of zircon that are 2.04 GA. I'll talk about that in a second. But basically, like I mentioned, not much is happening in the South Ray at this time. Very little magmatism, very little metamorphism of any kind. But we do have this gabbroic anorthosite and granite suite of rocks that's being intruded. It's forming a new domain in the South Ray we call the Penland domain. And so this max depositional age in my sediment has the same age and same chemical characteristics of zircon from the Penland domain. So I've annotated here the likelihood that this sediment was deposited or some of the detritus at least came from Penland domain rocks that were exhumed. Now to lead into the geodynamic setting at this time, this is some of Ben Neal's data that he's working on right now. And this is showing all of his detritus, but in particular the 2.04 GA detritus are highlighted here. These are derived from that Penland domain complex. And what he's showing here is that the zircon geochemical signature roughly point to a within plate or anorogenic, maybe even evolving rift type setting. And importantly, he doesn't see an arc signature in these rocks. And so putting this in the broader context and looking at some other rocks in this time frame, again, I'll highlight where we just were. This is the black triangle in the south ray. This is where that Penelon 2.04 Penelon suite is, and also the location of those sediments with a 2.04 max age. There are a few other gabbros and mafic bodies in the south ray of the same age, 2.04. There's one immediately west on top of the Slave basement, but it's in the east arm of Great Slave Lake. The stuff in Great Slave Lake was determined to be rift-related volcanics at that time, 2.04. There's also some broadly 2.04 gabbros in the central ray, including a sill up in the Montresor group in the central ray. Now there's a few older mafic volcanics that occur in the south ray as well. There's, broadly speaking, 2.2 to 2.1 GA dikes and anorthosites broadly situated along the Snowbird tectonic zone, all the way down in Saskatchewan, up into Nunavut. And these have been interpreted to possibly reflect rifting or incipient rifting or attempted rifting. And in Saskatchewan and Northwest Territories, we also have these black circles, which represent some mafic dikes and flows that have also been interpreted to possibly reflect extension and breakup. And on top of that, some of the work from Ron Rainbird in the ray cover sequence rocks, which I've broadly colored orange here, orange polygons, seems to have a interpreted extension-related affinity for at least the rocks that were deposited between 2.2 and 2.0 GA. And so overall, I think it's probably likely there's extension and possibly even rifting going on in the ray at this time. Now, I just wanted to quickly tie back to something I mentioned earlier when I mentioned an orogenic lid at Aerosmith time. See if I can make a little drawing for you. So this black triangle in the south ray, I suggested that because we have Aerosmith age cooling in the region where we have this blue blob that I'm drawing, that's where we see cooling at Aerosmith time, and perhaps preservation of an Aerosmith orogenic lid. Interestingly enough, further north in the central ray, where the Montresor gabbro is, the Montresor group sedimentary rocks there have a complete lack of Aerosmith age detritus. And so I'm also suggesting perhaps there's also other small isolated fragments of orogenic lid or these upper crustal Aerosmith fragments that never completely eroded, thus never allowing the deeply affected crust detritus to get into these sedimentary systems. The reason this is plausible is because most rocks of this age, most sedimentary rocks of this age in the South Ray and Central Ray do contain abundant Aerosmith-aged detritus. So I think it's an interesting concept that we might have these small preserved ancient topographic highs or erosional remnants of Aerosmith upper crust, and something that might be worth looking into in the future. Finally, this is a schematic cartoon for this time frame. Of course, it's oversimplified and spans 300 million years, but I think it gets the general idea across. First, I'll show you right in the middle, again, that peachy pink color is what used to be the Aerosmith aged high-grade basement that is now exhumed, at least partially. If it's not in the uppermost crust, it's at least upper middle to lower upper. And it's being exhumed, at least in part, by a structure on its west margin that is accommodating its exhumation. And that is the same structure that is being intruded by the Penelon domain anorthosite complex, which is this purple blob down here. So you can see a number of the mafic events listed. There's Orpheus Dikes, there's Union Island Group, there's Chittenden Dikes. And the locations of these possible question mark rifts at the Craton margins, of course, is the same location that we had in Aerosmith and McCoid aged suture zone previously. So you can see we're starting to develop a number of pre-existing structures, both suture zones on the margins, as well as significant structures like the MacArthur Lake Shear Zone on the west and what's possibly the proto-whole dialect shear zone on the east. We'll get to that in just a second. So moving on to the Tolston and Snowbird phases. I don't have new data in the Western Ray that pertains to these phases, but they need to be included in this broad model just for completion. So I'll just show you here on this Geocron summary that Tolston metamorphism and plutonic ages are very abundant and restricted to the Western Ray margin within the Tolston domain. You can see a large amount of data there. And then there's virtually nothing across most of the South Ray. There's a little bit of reactivation in a shear zone here and there, but then we have nothing until we hit the Snowbird domain on the eastern part of the ray, and we get an abundance of metamorphic ages. Not a lot of plutonism though, almost none, but high-grade metamorphic rocks being buried at that time, and almost nothing in between. So I'll just show you some general models for how these origins formed. This picture on the right is one of the models that Dave Corrigan published in 2009. And you can see the Snowbird origin. He's labeled it as the Snowbird tectonic zone. I'm just highlighting it in blue there. The idea here is that it's a collisional origin that involves microcontinent accretion of the Hearn Craton. And this would be considered an early phase of Trans-Hudson Orogenesis, so the early microcontinent accretionary phase during initial closure of the Manichaean Ocean. So in this model, the Hearn is akin to another crustal fragment like the Sugluk or Meta Incognita or Corazon blocks that are accreting to the Western Churchill province. Although I just wanted to also mention that there's alternative models for the Snowbird orogeny that suggest that it's an intracontinental origin derived from farther afield stresses. And I don't really have time to get into those details here. They're not terribly important for this talk. Equally though, the Tolston origin on the western part of the ray, and Thelon origin to the north. The Tolston is regarded mostly as a continental arc, although there's also some pretty compelling data that suggest that it's the result of possibly a plateau and simply infracrustal melting of its own basement. Regardless, these two origins seem to manifest on the outside of the South Ray, and that's really highlighted here in this geophysical image where I've overlaid all the metamorphic data that I could get from Saskatchewan and Northwest Territories. And you can see that the red circles, which are high-grade events at 2.0 to 1.9 GA, are really isolated to both the Tolston and Snowbird sides of the Ray Craton. And there's some lower grade amphibolite and greenschist facies metamorphism in the south where these two origins converge. But there's just a complete lack of high-grade overprint in the middle of the South Ray. And that's not for a lack of data. There's quite a bit of data in there. There just doesn't seem to be any obvious overprinting associated with these events. So a cartoon model may look something like this, where we have these two isolated yet contemporaneous origins occurring on either side. I've chosen to draw the collisional style model for the Snowbird and the Tolston. And you can see here on the Snowbird origin side, the whole dialect shear zone, which is beginning to develop here. This was an important part of my PhD thesis. This will become an important structure a little bit later in exhuming Trans-Hudson aged rocks. We'll look at that later. But we seem to have a lot of movement on various shear zones, but not a lot of activity in the center. Finally, we'll move on to the last phase of orogenesis I'd like to share today, which is the Trans-Hudson, broadly between 187 and 180 GA. This is a picture of that Penelon anorthosite, the 2.04 GA anorthosite complex with a nice garnet CPX metamorphic assemblage overprinting it. I'll talk about that data a little bit as well. Here you can see Tolston or Trans-Hudson aged events on this geochronological summary. First, I'll point you to the Tolston origin on the west, which was just imparting high-grade signature into the ray basement, and then it was exhumed fairly shortly thereafter. And there doesn't seem to be any obvious Trans-Hudson overprint in the Tolston terrain. Similarly, on the east side of the ray, you can see the big swath of metamorphic ages in the Snowbird domain. That domain exhumed very quickly at around 1.9 based on cooling ages, and was now probably in the upper crust now. So again, we don't see a strong Trans-Hudson overprint, at least in the mid to lower crust signature in the Snowbird or the Tolston. However, we do see abundant metamorphism and even magmatism in one of the domains of this broadly 187 to 180 overprint, particularly within the Penelon, McCann, and Fire Drake domains in the middle of the ray, south ray. Going back to this aeromagnetic map, these large yellow circles are where we have some data for the high-grade Trans-Hudson overprint. And again, remember, just west of this farthest west one, when we jump over into the Porter domain, we have preserved cooling ages that are 2.4 GA. And if we go east of our easternmost data point, we start to get cooling ages of 1.9. So this really is an isolated central Trans-Hudson overprint. This is data from the Penelon domain, showing on the bottom right, we have two zircon populations. We have an earlier population at 1855, and then a second garnet signature zircon population at 1840. I should mention this is work of Daniele Regis at the GSC. And on the left, we can see a PT diagram of how these ages fit into pressure temperature space. First, we have prograde metamorphism and likely burial going on around 1855, and then a peak metamorphic event around 1840. We're reaching around 800 degrees Celsius and a little north of 10 kilobars here. And then shortly thereafter, from data from adjacent rocks, we have a decompression phase at about 1825. This here is a compilation of this high-grade event in the South Ray that Danny's put together. And it's pretty nice that it's very consistent across these three regions, that we seem to have a very strong high-grade prograde signature around 1860, 1850, peak metamorphic signature at 1840, followed by decompression and cooling after 1830. And so to place this in the cartoon model again, you can see there's fairly widespread Trans-Hudson overprinting of the middle and lower crust across most of the South Ray, and probably even the basement of what is the Snowbird domain, but it was never exhumed. But what I'm trying to highlight here is you can see both the Snowbird and the Tolston origins that were immediately prior to this in high-grade, high-pressure conditions were shot up into the upper crust. And that's what's preserved today. And we don't seem to see the Trans-Hudson overprint there. It seems to have been exhumed from the central region as well as from the Hearn Craton. I should mention that some of these shear zones that developed earlier, for example, on the west, there's this MacArthur Lake shear zone and Howard Lake shear zone, or Holdia Lake shear zone on the east. These shear zones were probably active at this time, burying and thickening the central part of the ray, and were part of the accommodation process to thicken up that part of the crust. Again, reactivation of these important long-lived structures. Now, I haven't really talked about the structures yet, but I should touch on them a little bit. After all, one of the main initiatives to go in here, at least for myself, was to look at the ages and kinematics of a number of these shear systems in the Western Ray Craton, particularly these ones here that are labeled, the Howard Lake, and then there's the Miller Lake and MacArthur Lake shear zones. These all occur right at this transition where we stop seeing high-grade Trans-Hudson events and we start to see these older cooling ages preserved. And so this, presumably there was an exhumation history recorded in these shear zones that I was looking for. So I'll show you some of the data from these shear zones. This is a simplified map on the left showing some wider myelinite and gneissic belts of the Miller Lake and Howard Lake shear zone, as well as the MacArthur Lake shear zone in the dashed black line. And on the right is a larger scale zoom in of the Howard Lake shear zone. You can see it's approximately 5 to 7 kilometers wide, mostly gneissic structure and mylanites, and a few thin attenuated units of different rock types within, but it's pretty homogeneous overall. These are general photos that just give you an idea of the types of rocks as well as the structures that were observed in these various shear systems. First of all, the dominant kinematics that were observed was strike slip right lateral deformation. So in the top left image, you can see a winged pyroclast being sheared in a dextral sense. On the right, top right, you can see a deformed gabbro that's turning into a mylanitic amphibolite. Those are both from the Howard Lake shear zone. On the bottom left, there's a nice megacrystic pegmatite in the MacArthur Lake shear zone being smeared out. And on the bottom right, we have a migmatitic gneiss and myelinite in the Miller Lake shear zone. Again, all of these have abundant dextral shear sense indicators and a very shallow, predominantly shallow stretching lineation. And again, these are just some pretty pictures from the Howard Lake shear zone. You can see a straight gneiss on the left. The middle picture is interesting. These are some of the interbedded felsic and mafic volcanics from the Howard Lake region. Now they're quite deformed. And on the right is again some mixed mylanites, amphibolite and granite and aplite mylanites there on the shores of Howard Lake. But again, the take-home message is examined quite a bit of rock and only saw, or predominantly saw, right lateral strike slip deformation. We really didn't see exhumation or kinematics that were presumably associated with exhumation. But the age of this late strike slip ductile deformation was pretty well established by analysis of a few cross-cutting dikes that themselves were very weakly deformed. And these dikes crystallized at about 1820 MA. So this is the final cartoon diagram of broadly what we see now in the South Ray. And you can see the majority of high-grade Trans-Hudson aged basement or mid to lower crust is now exhumed in the center of the South Ray as well as in the Archaean Cratons to the east. And the limits of this exhumation are really at the boundary here on the left. This is a structure initially developed at Aerosmith time. This was a high-grade boundary at that time and is now being reactivated to help exhume the Trans-Hudson basement. Also the Holdaya Lake shear zone on the east and the Snowbird Tectonic zone, even farther east, are also very important structures that were reactivated and helped exhume the mid to lower crust of the Trans-Hudson. And yes, just a final note that, like I mentioned, we did try to better study the exhumation structures to fit into this story, although they were largely overprinted at this time frame, about 182, into a dextral strike slip manner, which probably falls in with what we see throughout the ray, central ray as well, is a lot of dextral reactivation of many structures at about this time frame. And this might relate to tectonic escape style structures, as has been suggested previously. So really I have two main conclusions I'll leave with after going through this talk here. One is just presenting this general model here, where I think it goes to show that it's very important to critically analyze, especially in these complex polycyclic regions, really understand the extent and magnitude of each orogenic phase, various structures and anisotropies that may form, and how they interact with subsequent orogenic phases. Because I think this is an example that nicely shows a modern day complex region that the data I've presented here is very consistent and reconciles how we went from A to F essentially on this diagram. And I think it's important that we continue to do this type of work in these complex Archaean regions to better understand how the crust gained its current architecture. The second conclusion is something I haven't actually talked about yet, but the more well-studied northern segment of the Trans-Hudson from the Quebec or Ungava promontory of the Superior Craton, the across-strike effects of this into Baffin Island are known for at least 800 kilometers across strike. And I think it's interesting now that we're able to show in the southern part of this, where we have this Manitoba promontory or indenter, if you want to call it that, we're now seeing the bona fide effects of the Trans-Hudson origin well into the South Ray Craton and possibly almost brushing up against the Tolston origin. And it's just interesting to point out this is much more symmetrical than was previously known. We used to think that the Trans-Hudson effects stopped at the Snowbird tectonic zone in the East Ray margin, but we know that it affected the South Ray crust quite extensively. But hopefully today I've been able to show you how that complex overprinting is a result of all the prior orogenic events. Anyway, that's the end of the talk for now, and thanks for sticking around and listening. I'm happy to field any questions.